Study Session 12, Africa in the International System. Introduction. In the previous study session, we examined the nature of Middle East in global affairs. In this study session, we will discuss the position of Africa in the international system. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to examine the status of African states in international politics and discuss the challenges plaguing African states. Features of African states in the international system. The first thing you have to note is that a number of characteristics distinguish Africa and African states from the rest of the international system. First, statehood was imposed on African societies, resulting in artificial borders that in many instances separated communities and even created new ethnic groups. To elaborate on this, the Berlin Conference of 1884 set the scene for what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Without regard for existing systems of rule, the colonial powers staked their claims to African territories. These claims reflected the goals of status and prestige of the colonial states and their economic needs and interests. Tip: the Berlin Conference of 1884 set the scene for what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Without regard for existing systems of rule, the colonial powers staked their claims to African territories. Essentially, the Westphalia states of Europe developed over centuries to reflect compromises between rulers and ruled, and rulers among each other. These states came to form units of production and units of meaning, thereby making social, cultural, and economic sense. In contrast, African states were created and statehood was imposed at independence regardless of logic or historical, social, economic, and political conditions. What I am saying in essence is that the state was born in Europe and then exported to Africa by colonial powers, notably Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal. As Opello rightly put it, it is impossible to understand the development of modern states without taking into account the way European states constructed and interconnected global order by means of conquest, trade, religious conversion, and diplomacy. This is according to Opello, 1999. From the foregoing, the resulting artificial states, in comparison with their European counterparts and their position in the international political economy, were therefore confronted by two major threats. The first was the unequal distribution of resources across national borders, and the second was the lack of social and political coherence, that is, unity, inside these states. Note: the Westphalia states of Europe came to form units of production and units of meaning, thereby making social, cultural, and economic sense. In contrast, African states were created and statehood was imposed at independence regardless of logic or historical, social, economic, and political conditions. The second characteristic of African states is that the continent is the least developed on Earth, suffering from the highest levels of human insecurity, deprivation, and poverty. It has been argued that sub-Saharan Africa has the highest percentage of poverty in the world, with 62% of its population living in this condition, compared with 25% of Asia's population and 35% of Latin America. Thirdly, the very high incidence of civil wars, unrest, and armed conflicts occurring within states is another characteristic which distinguished Africa from the rest of the international system. Although much emphasis is usually placed on the civil wars on the continent in the post-Cold War era, care should be taken not to create the impression that civil war is a phenomenon peculiar to this era. In fact, various forms of civil war and conflict have characterized Africa ever since independence. Hint: very high incidence of civil wars, unrests, and armed conflicts occurring within states is another characteristic which distinguished Africa from the rest of the international system. What is important here is to examine the international dimension of armed conflicts in Africa. First is the separatist wars, which saw an international involvement. Let's take Congolese Civil War of the early 1960s as a point of reference. The Congo crisis, later renamed as the Democratic Republic of Congo, involved a struggle for leadership of the country, with at one stage during the war 4 different leaders and factions claiming to be governing the country. It was also a war of secession, with the country's richest province, Katanga, and Kasai province fighting for independence. The international dimension of this interstate war served to complicate and extend the war. On one hand, the United Nations, the UN, attempted to restore order and stability to the country. It launched the UN Congo Operation, ONUC, which turned out to be its most expensive peacekeeping operation in the pre-1990 era, lasting from 1961 to 1963, and eventually managed to retain the territorial unity of the country. On the other hand, the continued Belgian intervention served to prolong the war. Reflection: armed conflicts have dominated African states for the past 3 decades. One significant thing you must know is that these civil wars or armed conflicts are often a result or aided by the weaknesses of states in which they take place, thereby complicating foreign intervention. This now explains our position of weakness of African states in the realm of international politics. The second example of armed conflicts in Africa is that of intrastate conflicts, which centers on the struggle for control of the state, often involving external intervention. This type of conflict can be categorized into 2. The first is that of struggle based on or supported by mass movements or large sections of the population with the aim of gaining control of the government for large-scale democratic transformation, e.g., Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, in Namibia during the 1960s and 1970s. This low-intensity conflict, largely confined to the northern borders of Namibia in terms of its military dimension, saw large-scale international involvement in the conflict itself and in its solutions from external states and non-governmental organizations, NGOs. The second type of intrastate armed conflicts is the struggles by small groups with or without large-scale support from the population, whose aim is control of the state and not necessarily only the government for personal benefit, e.g., the civil war in Somalia. You must be aware that armed conflicts have dominated African states for the past 3 decades. One significant thing you must know is that these civil wars or armed conflicts are often a result of or aided by the weakness of the states in which they take place, thereby complicating foreign intervention. This now explains our position of weakness of African states in the realm of international politics. Africa's relations with the rest of the world. How does Africa relate with the rest of the world? Perhaps it will be necessary for you to read more about colonialism in Africa before you can understand Africa's relations with the rest of the world. Colonialization incorporated Africa into a very specific position in the international economic division of labor, and this encourages extensive and continuing links with the economies of the former colonial countries. Africa's continued interaction with the rest of the world, especially with the Western industrialized countries, can be explained in both economic and political terms. African states produce basic commodities like copper. They had very little, if any, access to skills, technology, and other resources needed to add value to these commodities. In order to sell their products, they were, despite the attainment of political independence, still dependent on many of the economic structures established during the colonial era. This necessarily put them in close and continued contact with the West, and particularly the former colonial powers. Tip: colonialization incorporated Africa into a very specific position in the international economic division of labor, and this encourages extensive and continuing links with the economies of the former colonial countries. Political ties also characterize the relations between Africa and the West. However, instances of tension and conflict between African countries and the former metropolis, most notably France and the United Kingdom, and African criticism of the West did not exclude continuing political ties between these countries and the former colonial powers. African countries have often needed the tangible support in many instances of these powers in providing or maintaining their military and political security. In addition, the relations of some African countries with those of the West, usually the former colonial masters, can also be explained in terms of the fact that some regimes at times have needed the external support for their continued survival. The former colonial powers also maintained other forms of political ties with the new states by, for instance, assisting in maintaining and developing state structures such as bureaucracies. Many African civil servants, military personnel, and police officers were and are still trained in Britain and Commonwealth countries. This makes for the forging of various links at various levels between these countries, contributing to the continued existence of strong ties between them. Internal and external problems of post-colonial African states. Two problems are confronting African states immediately after independence. Most of the internal problems are derived from the state's attempt to dominate and control virtually all areas of national life: political, social, economic, and cultural. This tendency followed the centralist approach to development, nation building, and political stability. Read your POS 2014 on more explanation on nation building. We shall begin by analyzing those internal problems. Tip: most of the internal problems are derived from states' attempts to dominate and control virtually all areas of national life: political, social, economic, and cultural. This tendency followed the centralist approach to development, nation building, and political stability. First is the issue of development. At independence, very few African countries had a viable private sector and national bourgeoisie that were able to generate capital and play the roles expected of them in the development process. Very few private enterprises that were engaged in small-scale manufacturing, banking, insurance, and trading were owned by foreign, mostly European entrepreneurs and MNCs. In order to move towards the developmental agenda, African leaders centralized the political authority. This led to struggling for power at the center and subsequent corruption of the system. Thus, resources had been drained by the corrupt and inefficient African leaders. However, this forced many African states to rely increasingly on foreign aids and loans. This was the background to the foreign debt crisis and the implementation of the SAP that had crippled most African countries since the 1980s. Reflection: since independence, most states in sub-Saharan Africa have remained monocultural, that is, dependent on the export of one or a few cash crops: cotton, cocoa, groundnuts, rubber, sugar, tea, and coffee. Animal products such as cattle, beef, hides and skins, and fish, or minerals such as copper, oil, diamonds, gold, uranium, bauxite, and iron ore for their foreign exchange earnings. With the exception of South Africa, they are not industrialized and are technologically dependent on the industrialized powers. The second internal problem was the failure of African states to have a hegemonic nation building and political stability. Given the arbitrary manner of their creation and bringing together of different and sometimes hostile ethnic, regional, and racial groups, most African states were, at independence, artificial states that, if not carefully held together, could disintegrate. The eruption of civil war in the Congo and Nigeria soon after independence, and many others thereafter, such as Chad, Sudan, Liberia, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, Sierra Leone, and so on, as well as strong challenges to central authority and separatist movements in several others, such as Senegal and Ethiopia, clearly showed the problem of nation building and political stability. This has been compounded with one-party rule system and military rule. In this context, most post-independence African leaders felt that the best way to arrest potential or real disintegration and political instability was to discourage or prevent the expression of differences that threatened national integration. They consequently outlawed or suppressed opposition parties, which were accused, with some justification, of promoting ethnic and regional divisive interests. This development led to the adoption of one-party system in some African countries. Closely linked to the above is the proliferation of military rule in some parts of the African continent. In the 1960s and 1970s and in the 1980s, military rule was a prominent feature in the African political landscape. There was military rule in many countries: Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, the Central African Republic, Zaire, Uganda, Burundi, Mali, Niger, the Congo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Ethiopia, and Gambia. By now, you ought to know many reasons why military intervened in African politics. You can read more on that in POS 214. The phenomenal increase in military rule in Africa contributed greatly to the weakening of democratic values such as rule of law, judicial autonomy, accountability, and tolerance of opposition. This, however, affected Africa's relations with the rest of the world, as military rule was considered an aberration. The external problems refer to those problems emanating from outside the boundaries and control of the post-colonial African states. These problems are fundamental to understanding the problems of the contemporary state in Africa, not only because they are closely linked to the internal problems, but also because even if the internal problems could be overcome, the external problems seriously incapacitate the state. The external problems mainly derive from the peripheral location of African states in the global capitalist system and the unequal exchange that characterizes its relations with the dominant center of that system. Since independence, most states in sub-Saharan Africa have remained monocultural, that is, dependent on the export of one or a few cash crops such as cocoa, cotton, groundnut, rubber, sugar, tea, and coffee. Animal products such as cattle, beef, hides and skin, and fish, or minerals such as copper, oil, diamonds, gold, uranium, bauxite, and iron ore for their foreign exchange earnings. With the exception of South Africa, they are not industrialized and are technologically dependent on the industrialized powers. In view of this, a study of Africa in the international system is very important because these characteristics have serious implications for the role of African states in the global system. In particular, the dependence on one or a few export commodities makes the economies being influenced or manipulated by international markets. This often affects the continent as their resources and revenues are diminished. Thus, they are forced to obtain loans from the World Bank, IMF, and other international creditors to offset balance of payment deficits and other financial problems. Group activity. With your course group, develop an action plan for African states towards achieving improved status in international politics. Study session summary. In this study session, we discussed that African states are weak, poor, and dependent and underdeveloped in the global system. This can be attributed to imposed statehood on African societies. There are several features which distinguish African states from the rest of the world: poverty, human insecurity, and prolonged armed conflicts or civil wars. African states are politically independent but economically dependent on the former colonial masters. This dependence, however, subjected African states to the manipulation of their economies by international markets. The negative effect is poverty and underdevelopment of the continent. End of study session 12. Thanks for listening.